The Lord of the Rings movies are excellent. They are masterpieces of cinema. They are genre-defining fantasy epics and a clear model for what all these fancy, big-budget shows that are made nowadays should try for. What they are not, importantly though, is a 100% accurate adaptation of Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. Arguably, one could not make a 100% accurate film adaptation of The Lord of the Rings. Certainly not for a commercial audience. Number one, because converting the books, which are very richly literary, meaning not in a sense of narrative quality, but in a sense that they are very much dependent on their prose, on the words used, and all the stories and legends that Tolkien weaves into the grand narrative. But also because the fundamental ethos of the books is not really something that a modern audience is looking for. It's not particularly appropriate to the era, to the tastes of contemporary audiences. Now, arguably, that was the case even back in the 1950s. These books, while we might consider them pioneers in some ways of what we consider the modern fantasy genre, they are, in actuality, a bit anachronistic. They are written in a style and a format very heavily indebted to the Middle Ages, to the storytelling of many generations and centuries ago from a pre-industrial world that Tolkien had a lot of respect for. Both personal respect and an ideological affinity, and also a sense of deep scholarly knowledge. The appeal to the Middle Ages as a reservoir of a sort of closeness, of a sort of community and earnestness that does not exist in the chaotic, deracinated, commercialistic, industrial world, was very popular in the 19th century, but even that was a bit outdated by the time of Tolkien. Compare, say, Alfred Lord Tennyson's The Idylls of the King, which is also an invocation of medieval epics in a modern way, and is influenced by modernity in some interesting ways, particularly in how it gives the medieval epic content of the work an elegiac, wistful quality. But in the 1800s, that was quite common. By the mid-1900s, Tolkien and C.S. Lewis and his friends there were very much in a tradition that no longer existed in the way that it had before. They did manage to, without even really trying to, lay the groundwork, the foundation for what we consider modern fantasy, but there is a significant gap between those fantasy works and something like The Lord of the Rings. Something like Game of Thrones is much more emblematic for where fantasy is now, in that it might have dragons and magic and the like, but it's fundamentally a bit cynical and a bit, I hate the term realist, but certainly trying to be as solemnly realistic as possible in all other respects. There's nothing wrong with this tradition necessarily, this new modern fantasy tradition. Not everything, of course, is as dark as Game of Thrones, but even something like Harry Potter, there is a sense that magic is just a quality in this world, that it's just a part of the setting, like spaceships are a part of a sci-fi setting. But the world is still, at its heart, fundamentally empirical. Follows the conventions of realist storytelling, which is not a compliment, I will say. It's not an insult either, it's just specifying that this is a different kind of tradition. This is a different kind of storytelling. Magic, for instance, in Harry Potter is something you can be graded in a class. It's a subject. In the same way that, say, math is a subject to us now. Tolkien is drawing from a very different tradition, one that's much older, and one that's kind of apart from modern audiences. The Lord of the Rings movies, while they deeply care about Tolkien, made a lot of compromises. And what's the result is something that's halfway between a well-done modern fantasy epic, especially with all the epic battles, and Tolkien's original vision. There are a lot of comments and criticisms that people make about the new Lord of the Rings show, The Rings of Power. Some of them are legitimate, some of them are not, but by far the silliest one are people who say that it's not true to the Tolkien spirit, and these are people who are enormous fans of the movies. And, it's perfectly fine to think that the new show's not very good. I disagree with you, but that's a perfectly fine opinion. But, please do not make the mistake of thinking that the movies are extremely in line with the original Tolkien spirit. They really are not. And I'm not just talking about things like the absence of Tom Bombadil as a perfectly normal thing to not include. And I'm not just talking about little structural changes that were made to help the epic work better in a 3-movie, big-budget fantasy setting. There are some changes that they made that I think are even better than the original. Like, for instance, what they did with Boromir's character in Fellowship of the Ring. Still, I'd probably argue the best of the 3. And just a really great film in of itself. I'm talking about things like the overall tone and the overall implications of the ending. I've already made a video about Gollum and how the movies changed that significantly. So I'm not going to repeat myself too much, but I will say that the difference between having Frodo kind of tussle with Gollum and then he falls in, which is what the movies did, and having Gollum win, overcome Frodo, and then stumble into the fires of Mount Doom and thus destroy the ring that way, is a significant change. And it is one that puts more agency in the individual in the movie version. Tolkien, although he deeply respects Frodo, fundamentally uses these scenes to discuss the fundamental failures and inadequacies of the individual will and the need for a greater order, a greater cosmic force to carry out the ultimate destruction of the ring. It happens, what to our human perspective seems like chance or strange circumstances, but it is very much part of this larger order that uses human beings to fulfill its will, but ultimately exists beyond their individual perspectives. And yes, for Tolkien, this is very religious. But it's not just that. The films, for instance, cut out the scouring of the Shire. That's not little, that's not insignificant, that is a major change. The scouring of the Shire is, for those who aren't aware, when our band of heroic little hobbits come back to the Shire and find that it's still taken over. It's still been ruined and degraded by the malevolent forces of Saruman, and they have to free the Shire from this evil control. And they do, ultimately, but it provides a sense of how much has been lost. The world has been saved, but only so much. There has been this psychic degradation in it. I think of Yeats, who discusses the human spirit as being sick with desire and fastened to a dying animal, and then desiring transcendence and release from a bodily form. Something very similar happens to Frodo. Frodo is in quite a lost, melancholic state in both the books and the films, and that's something I give the films a lot of credit for, is maintaining that. But the sense of a lost world is much stronger in the books than it is in the films. The sense that, in some respects, yes, the Shire has been saved, the world has been saved, but things are not as they were. There is a passing away of an old coherence, an old totality of meaning and purpose that does not exist anymore. The taking away of the scouring of the Shire is in many ways just a fulfillment of the conventional, expected narrative storytelling formula. You might have learned in school about the plot mountain, where we build up to a climax, have the rising action, and then pretty soon after we reach the end, reach the conclusion. Tolkien, again drawing from a much older and more medieval storytelling tradition, is not like this. He does not take this approach. He demonstrates how much has been lost even after the great final battle has been fought. Also important to note is that Tolkien was not very optimistic about the modern age, about our commodified commercialist society, which he viewed as spiritually empty and devoted solely to profit and productivity at the expense of the overall well-being of people and their communities and their history. Everything has kind of been lost in this narcissistic commercialist ethos that he views as what ultimately won after World War II. He writes an extremely cynical, certainly compared to what people expect from Tolkien, preface to The Lord of the Rings, where he talks about that, no, the story is not an allegory for World War II, and this is what it would happen if it was, and it is much more cynical than The Lord of the Rings. And he says that the hobbits would not last long on either side. Either the American capitalistic side or the Russian communist side. That neither side has any use for them. And by them he means this agrarian, communitarian tradition that he deeply cared for. A sense of groups of individuals connected to the land, connected to their history and culture and community. That does not exist in any reasonable way in the post-World War II world for Tolkien. It was destroyed. The literal green hills of England might exist to an extent, but what they represented as a sense of close community and connectivity, a deep sense of continuity between generations, doesn't exist anymore. The movies, conversely, are fittingly wistful about Frodo, but significantly more optimistic about the future of the world as a whole than Tolkien is. And I think that's an important difference to consider. Tolkien, like Walter Benjamin, saw history not as a blind ford, but as a kind of cataclysm, a kind of chaotic series of events in modernity, in which one is constantly looking back at the preceding world, trying to derive some coherent sense of meaning and significance between past and present, between what was and the uncertain world that is, to create a sense of at least tenuous coherence. This is not a worldview that a lot of Americans are particularly amenable to, like past or present. Tolkien became very popular in America, but it's not because a bunch of Americans suddenly developed a deep appreciation for Beowulf or this deep closeness to the old castles and cathedrals of medieval Europe. A lot of it was because of this environmentalism, this dislike for consumerism and industrialism. Like, a lot of those ideas are popular in America, and certainly were very popular in the 1960s and 70s, which is when the Tolkien Lord of the Rings books first really started to take off. But at the same time, there is still a great distance between the modern audience, even one who genuinely loves the Lord of the Rings books, and what Tolkien originally wrote, the spirit and the context in which he originally wrote it. To a certain extent, no adaptation is ever 100% accurate or faithful, nor should it try to be. Adaptation is innately a creative work. It's a process of deciding what matters, what is the core and the essence of the work you're adapting. But the fact that the Lord of the Rings books are honestly kind of weird and dissonant to the attitudes and to the context of a modern 21st century audience, especially a 21st century audience that wants to see big blockbuster action, makes every adaptation innately even further apart from Tolkien's original source. Again, that's not to say the movies aren't great. I love the movies. There are some parts of them that I even greatly prefer to the books, but they are fundamentally different, and we should reflect on those differences. So anyway, thank you all for watching. If you liked what you saw today, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Don't forget to tune in soon for my next analysis. It will be coming soon, that I promise you. Donate to my Patreon if you can, if you want to see these videos before anyone else. Adios, comrades.